Borrell, I wanted to say I love the subtitle that they've put to this opening session. You may have seen that it says in Latin, si vis pacem para verbum. We've changed the classic bellum for verbum because this is something that the university decided on. It's not my idea, by the way, but I like it because what we are interested in at the university are words, dialogue, sharing of knowledge, research, and of course, we're really happy that we can join this initiative. So before handing the floor over to Mr. Borrell, I keep wanting to call him Professor Borrell, although he's spent quite a few years now a long way from the classroom. But before handing the floor over to him, I've got to make a couple of announcements. Firstly, there's an app, which I think is called QUO VADIS EU, where you can follow these sessions. I think you can actually download information, and it's operative on all the different platforms that are available. You can also follow us online or via the EU links or the Commission links, or even via the university links. So there's lots of ways of attending this course. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Josep Borrell. I think there's a video, but first of all, you wanted to say something, I do believe. Yes. Yes, I want to say a few words after you've said welcome. I'm the person precisely that should have to thank the university for welcoming us here, and thank all the speakers who have been so kind as to give up part of their holidays to come and be here with us, especially my colleagues at the Council of European Affairs, the Minister of Overseas Affairs of Lithuania and Austria. I know that you're actually sacrificing some holidays, but also Nicole, also the Admiral who has been up until very recently heading up military assistance in Ukraine, and of course I've probably forgotten many others who I will quote during the course. And also thanks to those people that come back time and time again, these people that fall back on their crime of coming to attend this time and time again. This started 20 years ago. I think it's interesting that this happens, and I think it's a good idea to have a time of reflection about what's happening in Europe, especially these days. But having said a few words, I think it's important for us to listen to the Minister of Overseas Affairs from Ukraine, who was going to come here and attend personally, but as you can probably imagine, the circumstances of Ukraine means that he hasn't been able to come. But we've managed to get him to re-record a video of our dear friend, Dmytro Kuleba. So we'll listen to him first, and then straight afterwards, he may well be able to join us for the Q&A session that's going to come afterwards. It's going to be chaired by Aureo Molto, but let's have a listen to what Dmytro has to say first.
I truly regret that I cannot join you today in person or online, but I'm glad to share my thoughts on current events with you, and I thank Josep for inviting me. Russian aggression against Ukraine is a watershed moment. It brought the horror of a big war back to the European continent. When you look at the intensity of combat, the number of shells used daily, the length of the front line, and the scale of Russian atrocities, it becomes clear that Europe has not seen anything like this since the Second World War. Ukraine suffers immensely. In the course of the invasion, Russia killed 494 children. Over 1,000 kids have been wounded and almost 400 are missing following combat action. Ukrainian law enforcement has already registered over 100,000 criminal cases involving Russian war crimes committed on Ukrainian soil since February 2022. 100,000 war crimes. Just think of this figure. Behind each of those numbers are real human tragedies, broken lives, lost homes, lifetime suffering and pain of relatives. None of these people have ever deserved this. Yet, as it often happens, the thickest darkness becomes the background for the brightest light. The light of bravery, the light of courage, the light of kindness, humanity, solidarity, and humble heroism of ordinary people. Ukraine is winning the war that it had no chance to survive. This sounds like a miracle, but we know that behind it are the blood, sweat, and tears of our people. Just like no one expected Ukraine to withstand the full-scale Russian attack, no one thought that the European Union would demonstrate such unity and ability to act. It is not an exaggeration to say that the EU has reinvented itself in the course of this war. It gained a new sense of unity, purpose, and global role. The EU has found a new strong voice in its dialogue with China. It found a new meaning in reaching out to partners in Asia, Africa, and South America. The EU has intensified its efforts in the Middle East. Other nations have reinvented their roles too. For instance, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. They have played a major constructive role in global food security, the release of detainees, and advancing the work on the peace formula, among other things. All of these phenomena are parts of a larger process, which is the reshaping of global balances of power. For quite a long time, we have witnessed a period of antagonism in international relations, with well-established old alliances paralyzed by inner conflicts and an inability to take active steps. Rogue regimes like Russia have utilized this moment, as well as anti-American sentiments, to pursue their own goals relentlessly. Unlike many of us, they never lacked decisiveness, although their goals have always been malign. Things are different today. A new strength of the EU and the West, Ukraine's rising military and political might in Central Eastern Europe, Russia's diminished role after its failures in Ukraine, the freeing of the Central Asian states from Russian pressure and blackmail, a stronger role of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, China, and others. All of these tendencies are going to shape a new balance of power. What matters most to us is to utilize the moment to ensure decades of peace and development in Europe. In fact, we are in a new Europe already, the one that shook off its tiredness and took action to protect its values. Ukraine's victory in the war and membership in the EU will bring the success of the European project to fruition. Dear friends, the EU has provided an overall total of 16 billion euros in military assistance to Ukraine. The European Peace Fund has been instrumental in this regard, and I thank my friend Josep for his personal and tireless engagement in making it work and expand. It is important to note that support for Ukraine is not charity, but the best possible investment in the long-term security and prosperity of Europe. It would be naive for anyone to suggest that Moscow's aims are limited to Ukraine. Russia wants to harm Europe as such. A global and strong EU is not part of Putin's plan. He wants an EU in chaos and disarray, shattered by conflicts between member states, paralyzed by indecisiveness, and destabilized by angry voters. I will dare to say that we know and understand Russians better than many of you. We know their language. We spent some considerable time by their side, unfortunately. And here is what we have learned. It's quite a paradox, but Russians both envy and hate Europeans at the same time. Their propaganda talking heads constantly attack Europe for its values and spread toxic, anti-European rhetoric. But the same people have always sent their kids to European universities for study and prefer the beaches of Spain to the ones in Sochi. This is a sick attitude, but they want to harm the well-being of every European family so that they can point a finger at Europe and say, see, they live no better than us. Putin's Russia is a mix of revanchism, fascist ideology, external military aggression, imperialism, and disregard for human rights and individual liberties. There is no way to engage Russia constructively unless it fails badly in its war against Ukraine. Such a defeat is the only thing that can sober the Russians up, make them focus on their own domestic problems rather than trying to conquer neighboring states. Therefore, decisive victory, implementation of the peace formula proposed by President Zelensky, and delivering justice for Russian crimes are the basic requirements for restoring peace and stability in Europe. Those who say that these are unrealistic tasks need to remember how Ukraine was suggested to last from 3 to 10 days at the beginning of the invasion. We have proven many experts and analysts wrong, and we will gladly continue to do so. I have said earlier that the EU is a liberal empire. This is a metaphor. Please don't take it literally. What I mean is that the EU needs to get bigger if it wants to play big. Europe needs new strengths and muscle. The so-called enlargement fatigue should give way to ambition. Since February 2022, the European Union as a whole and its member states have proven multiple times that they have it, including by granting Ukraine EU candidate status last year. We are now on our way to fulfilling all the tasks outlined by the European Commission, and we work hard to realize domestic transformations even while fighting a war. Just last week, President Zelensky signed one of the key laws required for opening EU accession talks. It ensures transparency and integrity in the qualifications of the Constitutional Court judges. We are fighting a war with one hand and transforming the country with the other. We are determined to clear the path to opening EU accession talks this year. Friends, we need to stay strong and united, play big and be ambitious, look beyond the horizon and protect our values fiercely. Ukrainians are doing exactly this today. The times of hardships will pass. A new Europe will be born with Ukraine as its integral part. A new balance of power will ensure decades of peace and stability for all Europeans, so that no other children have to die in a barbaric and unprovoked war of aggression, so that Europe's foundational motto, "Never again," is set in stone. The efforts of each one of you present in this room are essential to this end. Let's keep the focus and stay the course. I thank all of you for your attention, and Slava Ukraini!
Muchas gracias,
Thank you so much.
Dmitry Kuleba. Now I've been told that he could contact at 10:30. Well, that is a little bit, it's a little bit troubled. But what we can do maybe is to ask the participants in the panel to sit in the table in order to start our discussion, and when he will be ready to connect with us, he will connect. ¿Nos permite, inspector, que invitamos a los ponentes a que vengan? Pero tú no tienes por qué marcharte. Yes, please. Aurea, yo me pongo... Sí. Una silla, otra silla. No, hombre, yo creo que el rector tiene que estar... Si te quedas de aquí.
El panel lo moderas tú. Ellos intervienen, los ministros y Aurea Monto.
Venga. Venga, poner una silla más, hombre, joder. El rector se sienta. Please. ¿Es tan difícil es poner una silla? Venga.
Cuando esto lo paramos.
Sí. se conecte, le damos la entrada y que participe en el debate, ¿no?
Let's make sure that I don't read your speech.
Exacto. Bueno, pues nos vamos adaptando.
Okay, we're adapting to circumstances. We're adapting to circumstances, so please remember that Dimitro is not on holidays. He's at a country that's at war, that's being attacked every day, that's being shelled every day, as has been happening in recent weeks. And this has actually affected port infrastructures that were going to be used to export grain, but now, unfortunately, are being destroyed. It may well be that he can join our dialogue. We'll carry on, and if he can join us, then we'll get him up on screen and we'll allow him to take priority. Here we are. Thank you for staying here to listen to this debate. Thank you to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, of Austria, and also thank you to Aurea Molto. And I'm also going to say a few words just to guide our debate. What's happening in Ukraine should be analyzed from three viewpoints. The military one, firstly, of course. The political viewpoint. And from the diplomatic viewpoint.
Hello, Dimitro. Do you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Excellent. I'm sorry we cannot do a proper Q&A discussion, but I'm at the Danish Parliament now, and while President Zelensky is enjoying the company of the members of Parliament, I asked to have for the opportunity to have time to enjoy your company. So I'm all yours.
Thank you, Dimitro. Thank you for your words, your introductory remarks. That were a good description of the situation and why we should continue supporting Ukraine. We are here with our two colleagues from Austria and Lithuania. And to tell the truth, now I don't know how to proceed because first of all, how long do you think you can stay with us?
10-15 minutes.
10-15 minutes. Then we have to give the priority to you. We cannot spend these 10 minutes talking among us. We'll do it later. So my first question would be how the counteroffensive is doing, where we are, and how much are you being affected by the bombing of the Russia against the civilian infrastructure and cities? This will be my first question. And the second one, which is the prospects that you came out from the Jeddah meeting? How do you see the international community engaging and looking for a peace in Ukraine? With that two questions, I think that I wouldn't that you exhaust all your time. So immediately after, I will open the floor to the participants in the school.
Yeah. So Russian missile and drone attacks is the real scourge of this war for us. It's something that we struggle to fight against, and it requires a lot of effort and a lot of air defense systems. And we know that Russia has, unfortunately, found the way to intensify production of missiles and drones. So we expect the by the way, is it like a Chatham House or people will broadcast me online? Because it depends on what I'm going to say.
You are in the air. The whole world is listening to you.
Is watching. Yes, so we are preparing to fight the Russian missile and drone attacks with new and more efficient air defense system, and we continue working with partners all over the world, including the European Union, on obtaining these air defense systems. But it's extremely it's no one in the country can feel safe. You go to bed.
Ahí se siente seguro. Nadie sabe si uno va a despertarse a la mañana siguiente porque puede haber un ataque aéreo, puede que no se despierta por las alarmas y un misil puede
From time to time. So no one feels safe in Ukraine because of the missile and drone attacks. The counteroffensive is alive. It's moving forward. It's not as fast and groundbreaking as many expected, but Russia had time to prepare its defensive lines. They reinforced them with concrete, and they mined virtually every square meter of the land, and I'm not exaggerating. And they dominate in the air. This is not a problem. And and this is why the decisions that were finally made, the first decisions made by Denmark and the Netherlands to provide Ukraine with F-16s, and it wouldn't be possible, of course, without the United States, who gave the permission, is such an important step. Counteroffensive will proceed. It will progress. We receive daily updates, and we see that our forces are moving forward despite Russian reinforced defense lines. Everyone who believes it's too slow and wants everything to happen in a blink of an eye, I have only one advice: try it yourself. How hard it is, how painful it is, and you will have different criteria for analyzing success of the counteroffensive. Some people want to see the counteroffensive in their newsfeed, but others, for them, it's a matter of life and death, matter of courage, matter of daily sacrifice, and it should be respected. And when people criticize the pace of the counteroffensive, they attack. They conduct an offense against our soldiers who are sacrificing our lives every day, moving forward in this counteroffensive. Jeddah was very important because it was the first time that China took part in the discussion. And we all know, when Josep and I discussed China many times, and we know how peculiar the situation around China is. But there were more countries in Jeddah than at the previous meeting in Copenhagen. There will be even more countries, I think, at the next meeting. And I think with this progress, we achieve a very important goal. We do set up the framework where Ukraine's peace proposal, called Peace Formula, remains, cements itself as the centerpiece of the peace effort. And this is crucial, so that peace conditions will not be imposed on Ukraine, but will be defined by Ukraine. And this is happening in practice. It will not be an easy process, but we're making very good progress.
Thank you, Dimitro. Do you want to add something to Dimitro to open the debate? Then we open. You have the privilege of talking with the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. Put yourself on the situation. It is not a banal colloquium with someone who is passing by. You are talking with the Foreign Minister of a country at war that every day suffers hundreds of casualties and is being destroyed. So please, your question has to be accurate, has to be respectful, has to be trying to put more light on what we are talking about. And now we open the floor. Can you present yourself? Usted, señorita.
Bueno, en primer lugar, dar las gracias y soy Pamela Varela, dirijo una ONG que se llama
Good morning, I'm Pamela Varela. I have a question for Minister. I'd like to know what you'd say to the young, because at the end of the day, we represent the future and the present. How can we take part? What role can we play to help both in the field of security and awareness raising, because there are many of us that are aware of what's going on, but others that don't see the importance of security. No sé si Dimitro tiene la interpretación activada. Sí, lo habría tenido, pero no veo la función de la interpretación. Bueno, la pregunta es, esta señora es la directora de una ONG y quiere saber más sobre cómo las organizaciones de la sociedad civil pueden apoyar mejor Ucrania, cómo pueden apoyarles más. Pero voy a recibir varias preguntas a la vez y entonces quizá intente hacer una pregunta. Más preguntas. Hello. Good morning. Machiavelli said that everything that has happened today has happened in the past, and you just have to look at past times to know what the responses will be for current times. This is happening in the counter-offensive. It happened in Nazi times as well. And do you think that Ukraine, at the end, will have to sign a peace agreement like the Russians had to sign in their war with Finland? Él está de nuevo preguntando por la contraofensiva. He encendido mi interpretación, no se preocupe, he comprendido. Mi pregunta es, debido a la presencia, a lo que ha ocurrido con Georgia, Donbass y Crimea, ¿por qué cree que esta vez ha sido diferente? Muchas gracias, señor ministro. Usted ha mencionado algo muy importante que es el tradicional odio que Rusia tiene hacia la Unión Europea. Eso lo hemos visto a través de ataques de ciberseguridad y otras agresiones. Y ahora la guerra que ataca indirectamente la Unión Europea y sus valores. Esto lo ha mencionado usted. ¿Cuál sería su consejo para la Unión Europea para proteger sus valores y para contraatacar este comportamiento de Rusia contra nosotros? Gracias. La última oportunidad para plantear una pregunta. Could you please introduce yourself? My name is Luque Uribe Echeverría. I'm a senator from the Basque Nationalist Party. Quite clearly, the perspective of European enlargement and the joining of Ukraine is something that I also feel is important, as the Minister himself mentioned. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Minister, how does Ukraine interpret the reality of European political cooperation, and do you think that European political cooperation is an alternative to the joining of the European Union by the Ukraine? Muchas gracias, Ministro Kuleba. Soy
the executive editor of a journal on international affairs, and I would like to kindly ask you to make an imagination exercise. I would like to know, how do you see your country and the European Union in 5-10 years? Thank you.
I think you have enough material to consume the next 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you for your questions. On the NGO, we have very vibrant civil society in Ukraine, and our NGOs are true heroes. They are involved in handling and tackling all kinds of issues related to the war, return of civilian prisoners, mitigating environmental consequences of the war, helping animals who suffered from the war, helping with reforms to make our country closer to the European Union, helping refugees, providing psychological support. My advice to you would be to identify the area that you are interested in, where your competence is, to find a strong local partner in Ukraine, and that will be enough to get engaged. And if you need an advice, you can address our embassy in Madrid, and they will help you with finding this partner. And I would like to thank you in advance for indicating interest in helping us to address millions of problems. War is about millions of details and problems. Thank you very much. Well, the short answer to the second question is that we will not sign a deal similar to the one Finland signed. If I will, it's never grateful, it's always ungrateful to speak to judge history, but I think if the world had behaved differently and supported Finland in a far more decisive manner, Finland wouldn't face a trap where it had to sign the deal. And we hope that the world learned the lesson, and from what we see from the supplies of weapons and political solidarity, I will dare to conclude that the world learned this and other lessons and stands firmly by Ukraine by providing it with necessary assistance to continue our fight. I agree with you that you can find precedents in history in most of the cases, but I would like to emphasize that in our case, actually many things that happened in the last year and a half happened for the first time. And many countries started delivering weapons to a country at war for the first time. The European Peace Facility became operational at an unimaginable scale for the first time. The European Union recognized that Ukraine will be a member of the EU for the first time after years of unnecessary and unfair doubts and deliberations about the future of the relationship between Ukraine and the European Union. And to fight a threat like Russia, you have to be ready to make things happen for the first time in history. If you do not have this ambition, if you do not have stamina to do that, you're going to lose this, you're going to lose the war. And I'm glad that we see countries, the European Union, and some other international organizations overcoming the, I was going to say the fear, but I have to be a diplomat, overcoming the concern of being the first. And I would like to thank Josep in particular for being one of the key figures in making the European Union make some of the decisions for the first time in its history. In times of war, leadership matters. In times of peace, system and bureaucracy matters more. But in times of war, you need leadership to win. Why this time is different given Georgia and Crimea? Because I'm talking to you. Because according to the initial plan of Putin, Ukraine was not meant to exist by now. But since we survived and since we found we gained victories on the battlefield, since we see support coming, we have all the chances to make it different. And in Georgia, peace conditions were imposed on Georgia. We did not allow to do that with us. In Crimea, the world swallowed the annexation of Crimea. And we did not allow the same to happen with the full-scale invasion. So it's already different, and it will be even more different for Russia. How to counter attack Russian behavior and defend EU values? Be proactive. The philosophy of the West is rather to be reactive to the malign activities of other actors, in order to escape the accusation of provoking. But whether you are proactive or retroactive, countries like Russia still accuse you of being escalatory today, of escalating the situation, because they think differently and their way of thinking is different, and they lie and they mislead and they deceive because they defend their narratives. Even today in Denmark, after the announcement of the transfer of F-16s yesterday, the first message that came from the Russian embassy today was, it's an escalation. I mean, come on, guys. The only country that has been escalating for years is the Russian Federation. Everything else is the defensive action. So to be able to defend your values, you have to go on the offensive, on the counter-offensive for your values. You have to be proactive. And I think that's what we are seeing in the European Union, on many accounts in the European Union since last February. There is no alternative to Ukraine's membership in the EU. We will not be considering any alternatives. European political community, as far as I understand, you are referring to this institution, to this format. It's a format. It's a format of dialogue, like a summit. But if EU wants to be a safe, and if Europe wants to be a safe and prosperous place, Ukraine must become a member of both EU and NATO, and as soon as possible. We've had all these discussions, alternatives, sub-formats to existing formats. This is all nothing. This is all crap. We're not buying it anymore. Actually, we never bought it. In 10 years, how will EU and Ukraine look like? Well, I hope Josep and I will be sitting down somewhere in Spain or in Ukraine, drinking wine and recalling a great victory of Europe in the largest war since the Second World War. We will be enjoying peaceful, prosperous Europe and quiet Russia that will not bother anyone anymore, neither in Europe nor across the world. Thank you. I have to run, but I wish you a very good, fruitful discussions.
Muchas gracias a Dimitro y gracias también a todos ustedes por el día.
Thanks, Dimitro, and thanks to all of you for having joined this dialogue. Several important specific things have been spoken about, and I think his response has been clear and specific. Ukraine is not here. They're not in a situation to accept the kind of agreement that stopped Russian attacks on Finland, which led to Finland losing 20% of its territory. The whole of Karelia and enormous regions were handed over in this accord. But that was when we were at the end of the Second World War. The international community wasn't exactly in the same situation as it is today. And he reminded us quite clearly that Ukraine will not, that will not happen with Ukraine, but that depends on our will to support Ukraine. It's also been made clear, both for us and for the minister, the issue of joining the EU. And also, this has been on the table for many, many years, but it hadn't been on the table for many years, and it hadn't been realistic, maybe, to think that Ukraine would be a candidate country in such a short period of time. But that's what wars do. They accelerate things. And with this war, Putin has actually achieved completely the opposite to what he was aiming for. He wanted Ukraine to come under his influence and turn Ukraine into a new Belarus. But Ukraine is now closer to becoming part of Western Europe. He hasn't attracted Ukraine to his orbit, but has actually projected it to the area of freedom, which is the European Europe. He didn't want NATO on his borders, but actually he's managed to get Finland and Sweden to join NATO, traditionally neutral countries. So now that makes us safer here. We're safer. He wanted the European Europe to fall into disarray. He didn't want the European Union to show a united front because of energy dependency, but that's not what happened. In fact, we've almost freed ourselves from energy dependency on Russia. That has come at a price, and some European countries are paying a high price via inflation because they've had to look for alternative energy sources. And now Russia doesn't know what to do with its gas. In fact, they're burning it. They're burning it as it leaves the gas fields, which cannot be closed. You can't just, stick. It's not like sticking a cork back in a bottle of champagne. Gas is still being produced, and as they can't sell it to anybody, they're just burning it off. And it's going to be very, very difficult for them to find alternative customers like Europe, because a pipeline that goes from the Arctic to China isn't really a feasible reality today. Yes, they can export LNG, but they're going to be far more reduced. I think Dmytro has been very clear on the fact that what's happening in Ukraine is very different to what's happened in the past, even with regard to how others have reacted. I remember that when Crimea was invaded, Europe didn't want to arm Ukraine. I remember a Security Council meeting in Munich, and they didn't want to arm Ukraine. They said that Ukraine had lost from the outset, and that would just lead to an uncontrollable conflict. And yet today, from the first day, we've done completely the opposite. It is true that the Ukraine army today isn't the same as in 2014, nor was the invasion, the massive invasion, as similar to what happened back in 2014 with the Crimea. It was more like what happened in the Second World War in Poland. And it's true that the world, and initially Putin did have political and psychological support, because it was framed as a conflict between Russia and NATO. And to some people that's still the truth. But this support has gradually been lost, amongst other reasons, because of the way that they've behaved regarding exporting grain from Ukraine. You remember what an African leader said at a Moscow meeting? It was just a complete diplomatic failure for Russia. They said, "Oh no, don't worry, I'll send some grain free of charge to the needy countries, but we're not here to ask for charity. We're here to ask you to stop blocking exports that are of a product of prime need."
It is also true that in what's called the Global South, they don't have the same feeling against this aggression as we feel in Europe mostly. And I say mostly because also in Europe, and I would like to speak about this now too, also in Europe and also in Spain. And it's a good moment now to hear about the viewpoint of the Spaniards. Some say, yes, this is a war between Ukraine and NATO, and as soon as Europe ends it, as if we were the ones that started it, the better. And this is a feeling that we see in the extreme left and extreme right, but more specifically in Spain, in the thought linked to the left of the Socialist Party. And in France, it's also very much present in the extreme right. I believe this is a good moment in time to listen to my colleagues from Lithuania and Austria that also somehow represent different sensitivity. Austria is a neutral country. I don't know what that means nowadays, but it is a neutral country. Yes, the minister will be explaining this. For example, Austria continues to pay for its part of the defense fund. Other countries like Hungary pay their part, but they don't allow their airspace for the airplanes to fly through the airspace. Lithuania, that has seen very close to them this attack. They know very well what Russia is because they've been occupied and invaded. And I have friends from the Baltic countries that say, yes, I've been deported to Siberia on 2 occasions. Therefore, I know what I'm speaking about. So this is one of the countries with a higher commitment and that is providing military support. And military support is significant, but it's not the only kind of help, because Ukraine is a state that needs to keep on running. So imagine we're making legal reforms on the one hand, but also fighting a war on the other. And I believe the viewpoints of the West and of the world need to understand better the causes and the consequences of this conflict. So that's why I believe this meeting will be very interesting, because many citizens ask themselves, why should I keep on paying for Ukraine, or should I pay more for my energy sources? How does it affect me at all? So maybe isn't it that the EU is being taken by the US to this conflict because they need to become intermediaries, and they are the ones that are paying the highest price, and they're just one more pawn in this chess game? Well, these are questions of the citizens that need answers, and therefore now I'm going to give the floor to the 3 members of the panel, starting from the Minister of Austria and of Lithuania, and later on Aria, so that they can say whatever they want to say, and then we will go on to the discussion that will be moderated by you, Aria. Thank you. Alexander, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. If I had to interrupt my holidays again, it would be again from Santander. It's a great place to be, beautiful, and thank you for showing me the region yesterday, and thank you for having me here. Many things have been said, and I'm very curious to hear the Q&A session afterwards, so I'll try to be brief. Yes, to a certain degree, I'm the odd one here. Austria is a neutral country. I read again and again news that we had, or we still continue to have, very close relations with Russia. Yes, it's true. Vienna and Moscow, since Russia, the Russian Empire, entered European history, we had relations. Not always friendly, but we had to deal with Russia. Vienna and Moscow always had to deal with each other, and yes, we had, as did, for instance, Germany as well, tried to develop some kind of partnership over the last couple of decades. We are not delivering weapons. That's true, we are neutral, we cannot do that. But I have to say Austria is #1 per capita worldwide, globally speaking, as far as humanitarian aid is concerned. That's exactly my approach to things. And the questions you ask are extremely important, because I'm asked them again and again in Austria too. Why are we doing that? What is our aim? What are we trying to achieve? Why are we doing enough to achieve peace? And to be very frank, I believe everybody in this room remembers where he was on the 24th February last year. It's a little bit like 9/11. This was a crucial time. It was a watershed. I sometimes say it's like geostrategic ice bucket that has been thrown into our faces, tearing us from our daydreams, our European daydreams of a post-national, post-historic continent. That somehow, when we see pictures of war, they're either in black and white because they come out of the past, or they come from a different continent, different region of this planet. And suddenly, 500 kilometers away from Vienna, and the war, Ukraine is closer to Vienna than the westernmost part of Austria. And Austria is not a big country. So it's actually in our immediate neighborhood. Suddenly a brutal Second World War kind of situation erupted. And I like to cite sometimes Robert Kagan, the US-American political scientist, who said nearly 20 years ago, the Europeans live in a post-historical paradise of peace, while outside the rules of power still apply. Well, you could say on the 24th of February, we have been kicked out of paradise. And nobody likes that. Nobody wants to be kicked out of Garden Eden. And yes, we somehow thought that Francis Fukuyama was still right, and there is liberalism and democracy will slowly, somehow, step by step, still prevail. Because we are deeply convinced that our model of life is the best, and I'm still convinced it is, by far the best. By the way, all the migration channels, they lead where to? To Canada, US, and Europe. Nobody wants to emigrate to Russia and China. There's a message there, that our model of life is still the most attractive on this planet. And I always continuously say in Austria, this 24th of February has changed. Our world has changed the European Union, and there's no return into the status quo ante. Whoever believes that with Russia or with Vladimir Putin we can go back in a couple of years to what we had before is deeply wrong. And now you might ask, why does a country like Austria, with such a historic relationship with Russia, with a status of neutrality, a seat of the UN, seat of the OSCE, why do we take such a clear stance in this conflict? Well, it's clear for us. Our protection is the fact that other countries which are stronger, which have nuclear weapons, still stick to the rules, that international rules and international law is applied, that pacta sunt servanda is respected. If we apply the rules of the jungle, countries like Austria are lost. And I believe Prodi once said there are only small countries on this planet. Some countries take longer to realize that, but Austria, we learned it. I mean, this is the country where Clemenceau said in 1918, l'Autriche est ce que reste. So we have paid the highest price of any country in the 20th century. And we have learned our lesson. And that's why we are so clear that we want an international system where even the big guys stick to the rules. And now if you come to the questions, and yes, this is probably something we have to ask ourselves. We haven't been perfect in the past. I remember that again and again in debates I'm asked about what is Afghanistan, what is Iraq, failures of the past. Yes, we were not perfect. We did mistakes. But I believe misdeeds of the past do not justify mistakes in the future. And now we can rectify some things. And our position is very clear in this manner. And if we ask now the two crucial questions, we have discussed them yesterday, are we doing enough for peace? Are we trying hard enough to achieve peace? My answer is yes. We're doing exactly the right thing. Because if we let Putin get away with this, and we simply stand by idly, not doing nothing, folding our arms, that would be a message to any wrongdoer, potential wrongdoer on this planet, that he gets away with it. Then we are back to the law of the jungle. Then we can forget about everything we have built up since the Second World War and the UN system. So we have to stand up for the values we believe in. So my answer is yes, and the best way to do it is to support Ukraine. As I said, we are not part of the military support of Ukraine, and I'm very thankful for those within the European Union outside who are doing that. We're trying to do as much as we can on a humanitarian front. And what is our aim in all of this? What we are trying to achieve? Well, it's very easy. We don't want Putin to get away with it. And to be very clear from the beginning, and I can cite Tony Blinken on that, this is not about defeating Russia. I'm personally not in the business of regime change. The issue with Prigozhin should be a warning to anybody who wishes a change of regime in Russia suddenly. I'm not in the business of dismemberment of Russia, but I'm in the business of safeguarding and supporting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country which is brutally attacked. Thank you very much.
Aurelius.
First of all, thank you, Joseph, for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here. It's such a beautiful city, and have an opportunity to present a point of view, which in some cases is a bit more strict when it comes to other voices in Europe, and there's a very clear explanation as to why it is, and maybe I will have a possibility to expand on that. You truly mentioned that one of the things is our history. Definitely it forms our attitudes. I don't think that I know a family in my country who has not been affected by Russian occupation. My grandmother, when she was 4, she was deported to Siberia. She had to spend almost 2 decades there, chopping logs and fishing in the cold Siberian sea, until she was given a chance to return to her own home country. My wife's grandmother, and you can go on and on. So basically the whole country is built on the memory of the occupation. These days, it's not just a memory, it's also geography. When we are talking in Brussels during our Foreign Affairs Councils about Wagner, we're talking about something that is quite remote happening somewhere. For us, the closest Wagner bases are as close as 5 kilometers from the Lithuanian and Polish border, to give you an idea as to how close to the action we are. I would like to start by reflecting on the name that was given for the panel, which is sounds very nice and quite provocative. Si vis pacem para verbum. Indeed, it's very, very important to talk and have a possibility. That's what diplomats usually need to do. But I would like to add a different slogan that was uttered by none other as Theodore Roosevelt, who suggested that if you choose to speak softly, it's always good to carry a big stick. And the question remains, and question that I would like to answer is, have we given a big enough stick to Ukraine so that we could have a chance to talk softly? And when it comes to opinion of countries like mine, countries like Baltic states, or countries in Eastern flank, we definitely do not think that a big enough stick has been given. Especially now. One of the main questions currently is, and Joseph, you had a chance to ask Dmytro about the ongoing counteroffensive. And we see day by day, anonymous commentators coming from different capitals in Europe and across the Atlantic saying, oh, it's too slow. Oh, it's not delivering enough on the results. And I have a counter question. How much did it take for us to debate the delivery of tanks? How much did it take for us to deliver rocket launches? Where still not all the countries, just 2 countries in the alliance are delivering the long-range rockets. We're still waiting for others. So how can you expect a counteroffensive to happen like this if we have not planned for it? And when we're talking about the biggest problem, the strategic problem that I had a chance to raise from the very beginning of the war is that you have to start not from the tactical perspective. What can we send now? What do we have in the warehouse? How do we achieve in the next election that we are going to have? But from the strategic standpoint, how do we assist Ukraine winning this war? What is needed to win the war? how many tanks are needed to win this war? How many rockets? What kind of rockets? What kind of strategy is needed so that they can achieve the results? And if you start at the end and you go all the way back, then yes, you can have complaints. And you can say, look, we had a plan. It's a wonderful plan. You were supposed to receive 2,000 tanks, 500 aircraft, F-16 or F-22 or whatever, and you're not delivering. You're failing at the plan. But if we didn't have any plan, we just delivered what we had on the warehouse, how can we ask of anything? We're lucky now that Ukraine has shown an incredible strength, an incredible resolve, out of bounds of anything that we could have anticipated, and used whatever we could have given them and made what they achieved now. I'm asking myself a question. So if we, at least some of us, would agree that there is a strategic problem, that we somehow, for some reason, are not envisaging the end goal of this. We want, go step by step, tactically, but not strategically. Why is that? And I'm thinking of two reasons. One reason is either we don't think that event is a serious enough event that we actually need to be strategic at this. We don't yet think that it's Europe or the West or even the global rules-based order is under threat. That is still a local conflict, bigger than in Georgia, bigger than in 2014, still local, not too serious. So we can take our time. Look, the way that I think that things are actually evolving, Putin is quite clear as to what he wants to achieve. And he was very clear when he said, maybe, I don't remember the exact date, when he said that the biggest mistake of 20th century was the dissolution of Soviet Union. And I'm absolutely convinced that actually he's correcting that mistake. He has already a leverage on Georgia with occupied territories. He has his troops in Moldova. He has a leverage on Armenia, at least he thinks he has. He thought that he does not have a strong enough leverage on Ukraine after 2014. He was not able to bend Ukraine onto its will. So now he's doing that. What we're seeing, if he's successful, is a slow encroachment of a decrepit empire. And yes, we want to believe that he's weak, he's slow, he cannot do this. But if he tires Ukraine out, if he tires us out, then the question for my country is, who is next? The second reason could be that we're worried that if we give Ukraine a stick big enough and actually is able to win, to push Russia out, to take Crimea out, that what happens with Russia? Russia has instilled this fear on us. They're saying, first of all, nuclear threat, nuclear blackmailing, actually. If you cross a line, there will be a nuclear escalation. There could be a nuclear escalation. A second thing is instability in Russia. Do you want instability in Russia? If you arm too much, as Dmytro said, even today, F-16 is already escalation. There might be, Putin would fall, and then we'll see something of a instability in Russia. Do you want that? And then we might stop. Oh, let's think about this. Honestly, again, speaking, as a Lithuanian, we've been in this situation. In 1990, March 11, Lithuania declared its independence. We did not debate it with our European partners. We did not have any. We did not debate it with our NATO partners because we did not have any. Our people voted for independence and we declared it. We were asked to stop, not to escalate, because our independence will bring instability to Soviet Union. And it maybe it brought, but it did not stop us. So, some of the key lessons. And additionally, if this is really a driver, if this is a real driver of a policy not to give Ukraine the biggest stick possible, then we are entering a very different page, opening a new page of our world history, which is very realistic, which actually would mean that power trumps right, that power is the right. That means that the liberal world order, where borders, human rights, people decisions, democratic governments are subject to power from outside. And this is a very dangerous world. Very dangerous world, and especially dangerous to those who are closest to those powers who can exact that, who are close to the powers who can exact this strength. In my country, countries others on the eastern flank, island of Taiwan, I think that they are very much worried when they are looking at how this event will go further. So I'm truly hopeful that we can still find our way out, not to be locked in, understand that this is not an important event. It's super important. It's a rebuilding of Berlin Wall event that we are seeing now. And that we do not give in to Russia's blackmail, nor nuclear, nor otherwise of instability. So what do we need to do? Plan for Ukrainian victory. Not plan to stand with Ukraine as long as it needs, as long as it's required. Plan for victory. They need to win. They need to win. We need to win for us. Continue arming. And this is where, again, I would just join Dmytro in thanking Joseph. Your voice was very much heard in Brussels and far wider, and calling for armaments for Ukraine. Explain to our people that peace can only come after Ukrainian victory. There will be no peace without victory. It will be just a delayment of a different war, a delay in the war. Call Russian bluff, not give in to blackmail, nuclear or otherwise. Explain to ourselves and to our people that Russia can lose. It has lost in the past. Afghanistan. You can go as far as Japan, like Crimean War in 19th century. And Ukraine and those in Russia's crosshairs need to be added to a rebuilt European security architecture. And this is what Dmytro very clearly called NATO and EU. If we want Europe safe and secure, those countries who are now used, who is leveraged by Russia, need to be added to European security architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Of your country for historical, geographical, and moral reasons. Before giving the floor to Aurea, I will use the privilege of being the organizer of this event. You said we haven't had a strategic approach. Our answer has been a tactical one, using the White House. It's a very clear image. What do we have in the storehouses? Use it. And you give two explanations for that. The second one was fear. Fear of overreacting and provoking a Russian reaction. And I remember that very well. No, take care. It's going to go too far. No? The first reason was?
That
can
it's
you
not
summarize in a word?
Not serious enough, that it's local and it can be localized.
So we could say the second is fear, and the second would be unawareness. Unawareness. We were not aware of what was the problem or the issue. Awareness, we didn't realize exactly what's going on, and the second one is fear. I think these two words can be cornerstone for an explanation of the history, the way it has been developing since the starting point of the war. Maybe there wasn't a third reason, unavoidable. Whatever you do, it will not change nothing. Ukraine will be clash. So it's not the pity to try to support them, like we decided to do in 2014 when Crimea was wrapped from Russia. It's unavoidable. Nothing can prevent it from happening. You know? And many people believe, and I was among them, that the war was going to be short, and Russia was going to be in Kiev in a couple of weeks. And in fact, they were on the outskirts of Kiev. But it was not unavoidable. So let's discuss about these three words: unavoidable, unawareness, and fear. Aurea, please.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks to the High Representative for inviting me to this new edition of QUO VADIS Europe, and I would like to thank the rector of the university and the university for holding these courses in this very special site. It's a pleasure to be here with Ministers Landsbergis and Schellenberg in this panel moderated by the High Representative. I would like to go back to the vision of the neighbors, which was the name for this panel, because after listening to Minister Kuleba and the ministers of Lithuania and Austria, I believe it's also interesting to look at other visions. And when I speak about the vision of the neighbors, I'm going to speak about the vision of the southern neighbors. And I don't mean only the south of Europe, but those that are outside the EU in the south. Because as a Spaniard, I believe this is a valuable contribution, not only for the panel members, but also for everyone in the audience. When I speak about our southern neighbors, I don't specifically mean the south of the EU and the Mediterranean, but I would also include all those other countries in the south, like Latin American countries. So I'm not talking about the global south with Asia and so on. I'm speaking about the southern neighbors that have specific political and economic intense relationships with the EU and even trade agreements. And they are countries that have a multilateral significance and are important for the EU being able to exercise its role as a global actor that provides stability and a geopolitical agent, which is one of the aims of the EU. Landsbergis has mentioned geography and history, and in fact, these are the two concepts that explain the vision of neighbors as the vision and viewpoint and positioning of all countries in the Ukraine conflict. That is geography or proximity to the conflict, how close you are to the conflict area, and history, and that is the link and relationship of countries specifically with Russia. As a Spaniard, I believe we have two very different visions of the war. In any case, the two backing Ukraine and wanting Ukraine to be defended, but coming from two very different viewpoints. So I believe this is an interesting contribution because Spain also from the starting point has no doubt supported Ukraine. Of course, in the country, there's different views, and the High Representative has mentioned them and how we have different positions at a political level, but also in society. But in general terms, there has been a favorable view of the support provided by the government to Ukraine. And it's interesting to look at this southern vision because from Spain we know this vision really well, and we know what the view is of the war and why they haven't really aligned with the EU in their position to support Ukraine. We know it really well, even though we don't share it, and even though the majority of Spanish society supports what is being done and the support to Ukraine. And I believe this is a valuable view, first of all, for other countries, our partners in the EU, in this case from the east and center of Europe, so that they understand why the war is seen in a different way from the south, but also for the southern countries so that they also understand why Europe is providing a response to the Ukraine conflict that is such a response. And in Spain we understand this really well, this southern view, because we have deep links with the countries from Latin America and also from southern countries like Morocco and Algeria. And this doesn't mean that relationships are excellent. Sometimes they're better, others they are worse. But the exchange with all these countries is continuous and ongoing, whomever is in government. And it's a relationship that happens at many levels, at a formal and informal level. So officially, but also through civil society, which is also very interesting and is something that we as Spain can contribute to the view on the war, on also on what to do on next stages.
Secondly, I think it's important to mention something that is actually obvious but was mentioned by Minister Landsbergis as well as Minister Schallenberger, which is that Spain doesn't have any borders with Russia and doesn't have any history of conflict with Russia. And in fact, we're in a peripheral situation to the conflict. So we observe the conflict from the European Union's periphery. And probably the European Union, which will emerge in a few years after this conflict, perhaps 5-10 years from now, as Minister Kuleba said, will probably put us even further into the periphery. And that means that Spain has an interesting viewpoint and can provide different viewpoints to the debating table. But despite being on the periphery of Europe, our commitment has always been thorough, complete. And it's also important to say that because many countries in the south want to know from Spain why Spain sees things differently in Europe. Because as you already all know in general, and I'm talking here about general knowledge, as we say in Spain, is that outside Europe and in the US, for different reasons, the Ukrainian war is just thought of as a local conflict far away in Europe, but which is actually having global economic and safety consequences for everybody. And the general opinion is that in this war, Europeans and Americans, but more especially Europeans, have a certain responsibility because they didn't know how to manage appropriately their relations with Russia and, of course, with the Ukraine. And so they think there's some kind of responsibility. We have some sort of responsibility in this, and they think that the negative economic and security consequences are being suffered by these people because of decisions that we've taken. That is because we've sent weapons to Ukraine, and we've imposed sanctions on Russia. So this is the vision to a large extent, generally. But there's a couple of other things that I ought to mention that we know very well in Spain, and this is when it was mentioned on a couple of occasions by Minister Kuleba, which is that the vision from the south is not unanimous and it's not one single vision, and that's why I think Spain's position in the debate within Spain is really interesting in the EU. For example, the opinion on about the war isn't the same in Chile, Brazil, Mexico, or other southern countries. We saw that in what the Chilean president said at the CELAC summit. And we've also seen that in Brazil, for example, the Brazilian president has taken his time, had some certain difficulties in establishing a real differentiation between the aggressor and the aggressed. In North Africa, neither Morocco nor Algeria have aligned to the European Union's position for different reasons, completely different reasons. But actually, they don't really support the EU's response to Russian aggression in Ukraine. So it's not one single approach. It's very diverse, but something else, which is that vision is changing. And this was also mentioned by Minister Kuleba. It may actually change even further in the southern countries. We saw that in the Russian summit with African nations, and we've also saw that at the Jeddah meeting a few weeks ago. Russia's behavior is suddenly gradually being viewed from a different viewpoint. The fact that they've broken the grain export agreement has actually created terrible upset in southern countries who have food security problems, and clearly realize that Russia is responsible for this. And also the current situation in Niger, how that change, or the role that it might play, or the role that Russia or Wagner militias may play, will also influence the perception that is had of Russia as a destabilizing nation, because the truth is that southern neighbors and many other countries have never actually understood Europeans' concern, or some of the countries in Europe's concern, such as Lithuania, for Russia's behavior, nor the degree of its encroachment in third countries. But this may be changing, as what Russia's doing is more destabilizing and more intolerant or intolerable, and this way that other countries perceive the situation is going to be key for negotiations and for any peace process that may start. What I'm saying with this is that the idea is that the outside European Union hasn't been able to maintain stability in its territory. That has created problems overseas, and that for this reason we haven't had on board or on our side right from the beginning many other countries from many countries from the south, but this is gradually changing. So I think it's important to pay attention to what people outside the EU think, what people from the south think, because this is going to need to be considered, not just so that the peace process can be successful, but also so that the European Union can be validated and recognized as a geopolitical player. It's important that Europe recovers its consideration as a reliable partner, but also as an actor that provides stability to its own territory, of course, but also to its neighbors and to the rest of the world. This is what I wanted to say, and now I wanted to stick to what Mr. Borrell has asked for us. We're going to open a Q&A session for all of you. It's about 20 minutes long. I do ask you please to say who you are, and please make your questions as clear as possible. Thank you.
Tenemos aquí la primera.
The first question sorry, you are the first. Thank you so much. My name is Jesus Núñez. I'm co-director of the Institute of Studies and Humanitarian Action. This is a question for Mr. Landsbergis, the minister from Lithuania. You spoke about planning for victory. Does that mean, therefore, that there's no fear of a Russian escalation, which is the argument that's traditionally being raised for this way that Western countries and US having of supporting Kiev, of gradually setting out red lines that are then crossed with a new arms, a new, more sophisticated arms, longer range weapons. If we don't fear this scale, and this is the argument that's being continually used to not go further, is there some other goal that's being hidden? Is the argument of escalation just something that others are using slowly but surely, even if that means that the war is prolonged and there are more deaths? I'd like to know what your opinion is about that. If it's okay with you, let's get 3 questions from the audience first, and then we'll have a session of replies. There's another question here. Firstly, thanks to all our panelists. It's been really interesting to listen to your viewpoints. My first question is for the Minister of Austria, do you ever envisage changing your position? What would have to happen for the type of aid that you're offering Ukraine to become more military in nature? And for the minister from Lithuania, do you think that the voices from all of those people that have suffered in Lithuania, that suffered from Russian occupation, should they be far more visible? Because I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge of what has happened in Lithuania. Should their voices be more loudly heard? And finally, the last speaker, you spoke about Latin America. How do you think civil society could help with this? I think we youngsters could be perhaps key to try to influence and try to get South America to understand the global consequences of what's happening. For example, because of security issues and because of the grain crisis, the fact that it's no longer a local issue, it's not something that's far away from the south. Thank you. Those are my questions. I've seen another hand raised.
Gracias.
Thank you. My name's Galini. I'm from Bulgaria, so I'm going to use... I'm going to talk to you from the other periphery of Europe. I wanted to ask whether the cutting of Russia's position with the grain, I'd say that is actually threatening the European Union's economic area, because I think there was an incident the other week with a ship in the Black Sea. We in Bulgaria and Romania, who from the EU have a territory bordering the Black Sea. I'd like to ask Mr. Landsbergis what the situation is like in Lithuania now, because in addition to talking about Russia and Putin, those of us that live in this area also know that in addition to Putin, Lukashenko's also a threat from Belarus. And Lithuania and other Baltic nations, together with Polonia, is also in a difficult situation and threatened by Belarus. And Mr. Schellenberg, you explained quite clearly the relationship between Austria and Russia over history, and the fact that Austria is near another conflict that emerged in the 1990s, the beginning of the 21st century, in the Balkan nations. If Austria is a neutral country, is it thinking further ahead about what it's going to happen when peace arrives? Because we all know that peace will arrive sooner or later, to try to avoid the situation of the Dayton Agreement. Austria knows that the Dayton Accord has actually really provoked many problems now. Let's now respond to these first round of questions, and I know that you all want to intervene in the debate and make your comments, but please ask specific questions. I do ask that of you. Yes, one question per person, I would see. I think let's have the first round of responses, and as there were questions for all of them, perhaps we could start with the left. Let's start with Minister Landsbergis and ask him to respond to the questions that were directly asked of him, and then we can move along the table.
Well, in my introduction, I raised two hypotheses as to why we might not be so strategic. It could be either of fears or unawareness. Mr. Borrell added another good point of unavoidability. I honestly don't know what is the driver, and there could be others. For example, I've heard that some of the countries, some of the bigger supporters of Ukraine are so mired in internal politics, that is internal politics that is constricting the assistance to, or the calculations that come from internal politics are constricting the strategic attitude towards Ukraine. It's difficult to tell. It could be a mix of those. But the point that I wanted to drive through is that those could be debunked. Those could be argued against. If we are afraid of escalation, which was promised to us from the very first day, you remember when some allies wanted to send helmets because they said nothing else is possible. We cannot do anything else. The only thing that we can send is helmets, or maybe a field hospital. And look how far did we go? Did it cause escalation per se? No, the escalation is that Ukraine is resisting. This is what drives escalation, and it's war. It has to be won. So there will be escalation until it's won. That is the thinking. There could be, red lines, practical, most likely, as to what can be delivered to Ukraine. But when it comes to, for example, long-range missiles, they're already using it. They're already using it because Britain has given them, as far as I understand, France has given them. So there's a huge question, why not other allies? And it's incredibly useful. It would help them control the supply lines. It would help them to bring victory closer and bring the peace closer. That is the thinking. The second point about the history. Absolutely. It was mentioned, Alexandra mentioned it, and we also part of this. We also were part of Fukuyama's world, believing that this is it, that we won the peace. We came out of Soviet Union peacefully. I mean, with victims that paid with their blood, but still, it was peace afterwards. We became part of NATO and EU, and therefore we were never so vocal as to explaining our history, what led us to our independence. And I think now it's a very good time to do that. That's why I'm trying to, as best as I can, to comment on this, and it could be done more. I have one advertisement here. There's an excellent book. It's written in English. It's written by American-Lithuanian novelist Ruta Šepetis, and the book is Between Shades of Grey. Between Shades of Grey. Between Shades of Grey. I mean, don't confuse it with anything else. It's a novel about deportation. It's about a novel of a deported family that was deported from Lithuania to Siberia. Last question about Lukashenko. Definitely, it is a threat. It is not just a tactical threat. It's a strategic threat. We've seen what can be done with instrumentalized migration. When Lukashenko invited and forced people to European border, to Lithuanian, Polish, and Latvian border, even with guns, pushing them towards European Union, towards our country. He can try to destabilize on his own will, but he can even do more things if he's pressed by his masters in Moscow. And what worried us the most in the last period was when we've seen how fast the units like Wagner's can mobilize and how fast can they move undisturbed through Russian territory. That gives you a hint how fast could they move through Belarusian territory. And in some cases, as I mentioned, they don't even need to move very, very far. So when we're talking in NATO formats about no-notice scenarios, basically when some militants would appear on the border immediately, it is now clear that it can happen with the help or without the resistance of Belarusian country.
Señor Borrell, no sé si quiere responder.
Mr. Borrell, I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of the questions that have been raised. No? Mr. Schallenberg.
Why don't we do we consider reconsidering our position on offering military aid? Well, we are a neutral country. It is in our constitution, and sometimes I'm asked how come Austria has not yet gone the way of Sweden and Finland. Geography is different, history is different, and in each and every case, and neutrality still has an extremely important support in the Austrian public. Over 70% across all the political parties, except one minor party, are in favor of it. So there's no question there. But what we do in the European Union, and that's the great thing we have in our treaties, we have enough flexibility. I always say we don't need to reform anything in the European Union. We simply have to muster the political will, and in this case we did. I remember exactly, Josep, when you called me, it must have been a Sunday or Saturday, right after the invasion, you said you're going to use the European Peace Facility. And I said, no problem, I will use the constructive abstention, so everybody else can move on. And then you asked me to call the other, then still non-aligned and non-NATO countries, which I obviously did. So the treaty gives us this possibility. And we finance more on the humanitarian side and not the military side. So there's no problem there. But to be very clear, and I believe I made it clear in my entry, we might be on military terms neutral, but Austria has never, ever been neutral as far as values are concerned. Just to give you a short example of history, we became full independent in 1955. That went when all the four armies, including the Red Army and the Allies, left Austria. We got the State Treaty and we adopted the law on our neutrality. 1 year later, we had Soviet tanks in Budapest, crushing down on the Hungarian revolution, you might call it, upheaval against the Soviet Union. What did Austria do? We voted in favor of every resolution in the UN General Assembly. We even tabled a resolution against the Soviet Union, not even 12 months after the Red Army has left the country. So we've never been neutral in this respect. Very interesting question on Dayton and conflict on the Western Balkans. Well, I could go on for hours talking about Bosnia-Herzegovina, Dayton. That's basically my homework. It is a very complicated peace treaty, you're right. At the time, it seemed to be the only way forward to keep peace in a country where you had three communities, Croats, Bosnians, and Serbs. And I believe it's definitely not an example, but probably a lesson to draw from in the future. But we have to be very cautious if we talk about peace treaties with Ukraine. To be very, on Ukraine or for Ukraine. To be very clear, there cannot be peace talks about Ukraine without Ukrainians. Sometimes I'm even mad at the discussions when people say, how come you don't make peace? But just imagine somebody had invaded parts of Spain. And then the international community, or some people would say, come on, you Spanish guys, you are nuisance value, just make peace. You know, get rid of these regions, let them go, and let us sleep again in peace. This is not a way we should be dealing with this issue. So no peace talks on Ukraine without the Ukrainians. And the biggest problem we will have in the future has one word: trust. Trust. Trust has been destroyed 100% by Moscow. So if we have to imagine any kind of stability, any kind of sustainable situation, it needs a minimum of trust. And the Russians have again and again, the Russian Federation signed international treaties, Budapest Memorandum in 1992, safeguarding and respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. They have violated each and every of these agreements, which are binding by international law, which have been ratified by Moscow. So how come you can that will be the biggest challenge, to create a system where you need trust, and probably one of the only solutions is to then get everybody on board, probably including China. But may I add, because you mentioned Dayton and Western Balkans, and Josep will understand why, we haven't mentioned this yet. We have focused very much on Ukraine, we have focused very much on Moldova, but Europe's neighborhood, and you made an allusion to it, Europe's neighborhood is not limited to the east. We have a very volatile region to the southeast as well, the Western Balkans. And since you mentioned Dayton, we have Dodik, we have the Republika Srpska. Moscow and Russia has the capacity to destabilize parts of the Western Balkans as well. And I have to be very honest, last year there was a moment where we thought maybe the Russians will create a second crisis area to just watch whether we are capable of coping with two crisis moments within our continent. Luckily, they didn't for a number of reasons. But I believe what goes for Ukraine when we say we have to clearly anchor them within the European family goes as well for the Western Balkans. We cannot afford to have a region within the European Union. It's surrounded by EU member states. It's not the backyard. It's the center court of Europe in a certain sense. We cannot afford a region which could be a source of instability with enormous humanitarian and economic costs for all of us. So what goes for Ukraine goes for the Western Balkans as well. We have to, this is for me the geostrategic litmus test of the European Union. If we fail in our neighborhood, we can stop talking about the Middle East and Africa. This is where we have to prove that we have learned what, Josip, you call the language of power. And I believe we're very good at and very fast now in learning this, actually. We have progressed enormously in the last 3 years. And this is one of the things, the results of what Putin actually did not want to achieve. We are thinking in a more geostrategic way than ever before. Thanks, you might say ironically, to Vladimir Putin, but we should not limit it only to the east, but to the southeast as well. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Mr. Borrell, shall I accept a couple more questions, or should we close this question? No, let's not close yet. It's taken me so much to get people here. I don't want to... I'll respond to the question you asked me later, if that's okay with you. Let's open the floor for more questions.
Thank you. My name is Nick. I am the Vice President of the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. And I have a question for Minister Landsbergis. Thank you very much for your introduction. I think you said very important thing, and I want to comment and ask a question on the fear. I think it's normal. Fear, it's a normal feeling. And it's even a serious feeling when it comes to war against a nuclear country. And it's a proof that nuclear deterrence is working. If we are afraid of nuclear escalation, we hope that they are afraid of our own nuclear escalation. So I don't think it's nice to criticize the fear. It's a way, it's a piece of strategy against Russia, which is a nuclear country. So my question is, but I agree with you that it prevents us to have a strategic vision, even though we are very divided, much more divided than we think on strategic vision. But anyway, so my question on this fear is, where is, in your view, the limit between supporting Ukraine the maximum of we can and not going to a war? Is there a limit? Can we draw a line? We, the West, we don't care about what the Russians think, but we do it. Can we draw a line or not? If we cannot draw a line, then of course we cannot help Ukrainians until the victory. So I would like very much your comment.
Ahora, nuestro invitado, el ministro austriaco, tendrá que marcharse en cualquier momento.
Aria, the minister from Austria will have to leave, so whenever you have to leave, please let us know. Another question over there. Good morning. I am one of those that comes back every year to this course, so thank you so much for continuing to organize them. My name is Tomas Reyes. I am a civil servant of the EU, and I chair a working group of the Council that brings together every week representatives of different member states to discuss our relationships with Latin America, because let's not forget that 60 years ago, they were at different sides of a conflict that is as bloody as the one that is happening now in Europe. It was wonderful to hear you speak about the peace process. In fact, it was the Director for Foreign Policy that did so. But I believe that the priority now is to speak about winning the war. The minister was very clear at the beginning of the session. It is a country, a government that is sending its young people, its future to the trenches. I've spoken with a man that left Brussels and was going to Ukraine and knew that at some point he was going to be in war. And these are conversations that I never thought I would have in my life. So my question has to do with the role of Russia, and I know that this is complex, in the peace process. What is going to happen with a defeated Russia? and what is the role of Russia in this process, but also in the new architecture of defense and security that has been mentioned. I understand this is complex. It is maybe too soon to speak about this, but I would like to know what's your view on this fact, the fact that Russia will have to become part of the solution. We've seen in European history that winning a war is not enough. It's just creating the foundations for an even bloodier conflict that can be even more complex. And we saw this after the First World War. So I would like to know what's your view on this idea of a calm Russia, as you explained, that I also believe is very difficult to imagine knowing the geography and history of the country. Thank you. Let's take two more questions. Yes, right there at the back, there's a lady with her hand up.
Irene, I'm a young professional in international relations, and since we're speaking about neighborhood and the external aspects of the European Union, I'd like to ask on youth, peace and security. We have the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda by the United Nations, which is made up of 3 resolutions. And last year, 2022, was the year which the European Union dedicated to youth, and in the first week of October 2022, the EU Action Plan on Youth Action Plan was released. So I would like to ask in this rearmed, what are the main highlights or remarks that you could offer on the current role of youth and on the impacts on youth, but also on the whole topic of youth, peace and security, given the youth, peace and security, given the current circumstances of the war in Ukraine, to put the focus on youth, peace and security. Thanks.
Y allí, sí, está.
Oh, there's someone else in the back, I believe. Hello. My name is Andres Martinez. I am from Foreign Policy for the government of Andalusia. And my question is for the High Representative, but also for the representatives of Lithuania and Austria. And it has to do with the concept of a strategic autonomy in the EU. In my view, and I believe this is the general opinion, the defense policy has really progressed, but when we talk about implementing it, in this case with the invasion of Russia, can we demonstrate, or we have demonstrated, that still the EU and the member states depend on the weapon systems and the leadership of the US when defending the European territory? So my question is mainly for the High Representative and how we can advance and progress, and don't you believe it's necessary to strengthen and to take this attack as a catalyzer to really strengthen the arms systems and the arms industry in Europe, so not to have to depend on the US or other foreign powers when defending our integrity. So let's now start, and we will start with Mr. Schallenberg.
Some of these questions would probably require an own session here. I will be back. As far as the role of Russia in the future is concerned, this is probably an extremely tricky question. It's hard to answer now. I like sometimes to cite Egon Bahr, the German socialist who was the architect of the Ostpolitik at the time, 50 years ago, who said, America is irreplaceable, but Russia is unmovable. Whatever happens, Russia will be our biggest geographical neighbor. Whatever happens, it will probably be still number 1 as far as nuclear warheads are concerned. It is still a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN. We cannot talk about climate or any other issues without including Russia, as we cannot do that without including China. I mean, the planet is not the way we like it, maybe. We as foreign ministers, we have to deal in different shades of gray. It's not black and white. And from my perspective, the big question is a security architecture, and that was always the knowledge. Steinmeier once said, there cannot be lasting security against Russia, only with Russia. This is probably the biggest question mark here. Can we fathom and imagine a European security structure where we exclude Russia? The problem is, by doing so, we would probably exclude Central Asia too, and Southern Caucasus probably too. What I'm alluding at is not, this won't be astonishing to you, is the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It is based in Vienna, and I feel a lot of ownership for it. It is our lifeline to Central Asia and Southern Caucasus. And there, Russia and Belarus, every week they get together. And it's outside of the UN, actually the only platform still, and I believe we will need it in the future. We cannot cancel Russia. We cannot do ghosting on it. We cannot do canceling and ghosting on China either, or on any other country on this planet. But how these, as I said, and I believe Gabrielus mentioned it too, that, I mean, we have a trust issue. We have a country here who has been attacking Georgia, who has been invading and annexing Crimea, who has 8 years later again attacked Ukraine, which has troops from Moldova to Armenia and other. What in heaven's earth has to happen for us to actually trust this country again, that they will stick to any agreement? That is the biggest question, but that is something why foreign ministers exist in the long term. That's our job. On maybe youth and security, I simply want to make a very basic point. Yes, if you look at the media today, you might be a little bit, doubtful as far as the future is concerned. You see climate crisis, you see war in Europe, you see migration issues. My point is actually a very positive one. We had for 3 years a permanent crisis situations in Europe. Since I've become minister 4 years ago, I never had a normal day, I have the feeling. We had the pandemic. For the first time since the Spanish influenza, we had a pandemic on this continent. And then war. 2 challenges which were premier in our lifetimes. And we expected, and many in the public arena expected, Western societies to fail, that we will not be up to this challenge. But look at us. After 2.5 years of pandemic, after 16 months of war, this decadent, weak, feeble Western open democracies, according to Charles Popper, they're standing strong. They're more resilient, stronger, more flexible. We can learn from our mistakes. Authoritarian systems cannot. And I believe we should take some pride in our work we have done, not us politicians, but the societies in Spain during the lockdowns, now in these challenging times we had in the last 1.5 years. So what I'm trying to tell young people is, believe in this, because it's actually a pretty good system. It can face challenges, it survives them. So this is my message, to be courageous, to be more proud of what we have here. And yes, the future is more daring, more challenging. 30 years of holidays from history are over to a certain degree, and we are back into where our forefathers were. But we are stronger and more resilient than we sometimes believe ourselves. Thank you.
Alto representante, ha habido una pregunta específica para usted.
High Representative, was a specific question for you regarding European strategic autonomy. I think the question was for the 3 of us, not only for me, if I'm not wrong.
Pero no me importa.
Well, the concept of a strategic autonomy is quite toxic in Europe. As soon as I speak about strategic autonomy, immediately there is someone that raises their hand and says, what about NATO? But these are not the 2 issues that are not related, and as words have lost strength and have become a controversy in themselves, like when we speak about federalism, no one stops to reflect on what it means. There is for a British person, it's something that they would reject per se. So sometimes it's better not to use these words and to use others that mean exactly the same thing but don't have that negative psychological rejection. Therefore, that's why since I'm in Brussels, I've attempted to stop speaking about a strategic autonomy and to speak about strategic responsibility. Maybe they understand this terminology better. But if we stop and reflect on the meaning of terms, what does autonomy really mean? As mathematicians do, let's look at the other side of the argument. What is the alternative or the opposite to autonomy? What would be the opposite term? Dependency. It is true that we don't like to be dependent. We don't want to be dependent. We don't want to be excessively dependent. We're all dependent on many things at a certain degree, but excessive dependency becomes a danger, as we've seen in the case of Russian gas. How did we build such a big dependency from Russia, even though we had warnings of some that said, be careful because Putin is not a trustworthy supplier. And the more interlinked our economies are and more gas that we purchase, the higher interest he will have in having a good relationship with us. But that wasn't so. And in fact, the strategic dependency becomes a hazard. With the concept of autonomy and responsibility, what we mean is that as Europeans, we need to be capable of confronting with our capacities, even though I repeat themselves, with our own capabilities. We need to face the challenges before us. And that doesn't mean substituting the Atlantic Alliance for another military alliance, because the EU is not a military alliance. But it is a community of countries that has the declared ambition in its treaties of building military capacities that can be used jointly to be able to confront our problems that no one else will be solving for us. In fact, with a low rate of success, because since the Petersburg missions were defined, and I don't remember when this happened, but I'm sure there's someone here that knows exactly when these missions were defined many years ago, in the year 92. So that is 30 years ago. And one of the missions was to secure and evacuate, for example, an airport in a crisis situation. Since I've been in Brussels, there have been 3 evacuations of airports, starting with the one in Kabul and finishing with the one in Niger, and also we had the case of Sudan, and there was no joint intervention of the EU. Each country has done things its own ways, however they could, and with their own means. But there was no joint action. Wouldn't it be more reasonable, efficient, and productive to have a European way of confronting this issue? That's what they decided with this Petersburg mission, but we weren't able to put it in place later on. And this will continue to be the situation, I believe, for a long time, but still we need to continue progressing. And one of the things that we need to work on is having an industrial capacity regarding the arms industry, because you won't have autonomy if you don't have your own industry. If you need to purchase your weapons from the neighbor, even though it's a very friendly neighbor, your dependency is a clear one. So we should have the capacity of not doing absolutely everything, but at least of covering part of it. And this also requires a joint effort to avoid intra-country competition. It has been said on so many occasions, and we shouldn't repeat this, but we have 27 different types of tanks in Europe, and there's only one in the US. And we have I don't know how many different aircrafts. So I feel even embarrassed by repeating this. So it would be better for us, but sometimes it's difficult to achieve this. So I am in favor of reducing dependency with the alternative, and that will mean increasing our autonomy, because if not, it will be difficult to survive in the world in which we will be living. And I believe we can finish with Minister Landsbergis and the question on the limits between victory and an open war with Russia, which was Nicole's question.
Start the answer by quoting different Roosevelt this time, who said that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. And I think it very much applies here. In the world of fear, the countries like mine will have troubles existing, because the same escalatory lines could be applied not just to Ukraine, but to basically to any neighboring NATO country. There has been a military, every 2 years Russia has a military exercise called Zapad, and usually it involves planning invasion of NATO, one way or another. And I think it was 2018, 2017, I might be wrong on years, but quite recently. So they planned on attacking a NATO country, which looked like a Baltic country, and threatening a nuclear attack on Warsaw, if Poles would try to stop their advance. So basically, it gives you an idea. And if you would ask me a question, so are you afraid of this? I would say I cannot be afraid. I wouldn't be able to live. The people in my country wouldn't be able to live. We have to trust that we are prepared to push back, to have an answer for any sort of escalation. Because otherwise, Putin has an upper hand. If we're afraid in Ukraine, we might be afraid in Lithuania. We might be afraid in Poland. We might be afraid in Spain. Who knows? We have to push back on fear. When it comes to actual lines and red lines, obviously this is way more practical. And what I'm saying is that, look, take an example of grain shipments. So when we understood for the first time last year in June or May that there will be a problem with grain because Ukraine will not be able to ship out its grain, the plan of using NATO territorial waters, because Ukraine is connected to through NATO countries to Mediterranean, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Dardanelles, Bosphorus and Dardanelles, all of it is NATO waters. So the plan was there, but it was not used. Why? Because it seemed escalatory. If we would allow grain ships to go through Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, and reach Ukraine, it seemed it would be escalation. So we did not do that. Now, when there is no other way, there's no other chance, because Ukraine is unable any other way. The agreement in UN is no longer working. It is a plan. It started working. And the escalation is not there. And how many times the word escalation was used during this war? Starting with helmets all the way to F-16s. Everything was an escalation. And what happened? Nothing. So my point stands. We need to plan for victory, see what is needed for victory, what is practical. Practical is where I would say some things are impractical because very difficult to deliver, very difficult to maintain, very difficult to train. But with F-16s, we could have started the training a year ago. With Leopards, we could have saved a half a year. How many lives could have saved? How could have been saved? Countless. That is my point. The fear constricted us doing things that could have saved lives. So now, if we admit that the fear was miscalculated, we might save lives. That's my point.
Yo, si me permites, creo que
If you will allow me, I believe the minister goes into a very significant issue that I've lived very closely. That is what we do and what do we want to do. It is clear that from the starting point, there has been a continuous hesitation. There has been this ongoing hesitation to give the necessary steps to supply Ukraine with defense capacities. The first decision was to send thousands of helmets. That is kind of ridiculous if we look at it nowadays, but that was the immediate reaction. And it is true what the minister just said. If decisions would have been made in a faster manner, and beforehand regarding the kinds of weapons that we ended up sending, probably the war would have been different, and in any case we would have saved lives. It is easy to say so after the fact, because we all become prophets after the fact. But when you decide to help in a military manner an invaded country, and the invader is using the weapons that it's using, hesitating regarding the degree of response is sometimes means a high cost for ourselves, but mainly for the Ukrainians. And then about the nuclear threat. China has reacted harshly against Russia when they have threatened with this. But the destruction of the Novakajova press or dam has had an effect that is equivalent to a tactic nuclear weapon. It doesn't have radioactivity, but its destruction effect has been tremendous. But as it's not nuclear, fortunately, it doesn't cause some rejections in the citizenship, even though we have the same number of deaths, because we are talking about different kinds of weapons. And I visited the training centers for the Ukrainian troops in Poland, and I remembered you when before the war, the Baltic countries were already saying, we need to provide military training, we need to have a military training mission sent to Ukraine. And we never did it because we didn't want to be provoking, and we didn't want to do so. But Canada already had this, and had so for many years before the war. And other countries did it on their own. But we didn't want to do it as a EU. If we had probably done this, we would have made the Ukrainian army more capable of doing what they have to do. And I've acknowledged this publicly. These hesitations, when we say, no, of course not, how are we going to send tanks? And 6 months later, we are sending tanks. Or no, why? How are we sending Patriot missiles? And then we send them. And the same thing is happening with the airplanes. So where does the escalation come from? In our case, it's a response to the intensity of the attack. And I ask myself why the U.S. is not providing this long capacity, because others are doing it, and we're all doing things in a different manner, because our view of the risk and of the fear is different. But I don't believe, or maybe we can discuss this further, but I don't believe it has to do with a preconceived tactic of saying, I'm going to give this help little by little so that the war continues, and that way I weaken Russia. I don't believe it really has to do with this Machiavellian view. We're saying, I want to help Ukraine, but just in a small manner. And I don't believe that's the idea. But in this way, I'm able to get Russia to use its military capacity. So no, it's not so. I believe there are other political reasons that have to do with the internal power relationships inside the American system, for example, and not trying to cause specific reactions. Remember what happened with meat planes when Poland wanted to give this airplanes, and finally it wasn't done so because of the reaction expected from Russia. But at the end of the day, we're giving them more modern aircrafts. So we will never know what would have happened. But honestly, I can see anyone and saying, I'm going to help Ukraine so that it's not defeated, but also it doesn't win, and to prolong the war and wear out Russia. I'm being told that now we do have to close the session. I don't know if you as a moderator would like to close this session. No, we haven't finished the session because in the afternoon we will have many of the people that were asking questions now here as speakers. So we will continue with this dialogue in the afternoon, looking into the different viewpoints of how we can build peace. So this is not the end of the session, but I do want to thank my two friends and colleagues for taking the time of coming here to Santander. And Gabrielis, I hope you stay in the afternoon, and you're invited to continue to be part of the discussion. And thank you both. Thank you both, Mr. Landsbergis and Mr. Schallenberg.